Morning, everyone. So today what I want to share with you about is partly about being wholehearted, and we're going to look at an example in the scriptures about Caleb, if you have never read about him, and about God bringing them into the promised land. And what happens is God basically tells Moses, send some men to Canaan, go, I'm going to give this land to the Israelites. So I want you to send somebody from each tribe to go explore. So he picks, a guy from every tribe, and they go explore the land. And then, he wants to know what kind of land it is that they're going to live in. Is it good? Is it bad? What kind of towns do they have? How's the soil? Bring back some of the fruit. Let's figure out how the fruit looks. So basically the guys go, and they come back and give Moses an account, and he says, we went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. That Amalekites live in the Negev, the Hittites. They talk about these guys that live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live along the sea. And basically, Caleb silenced the people and says, hey, we should go up and take possession of the land because we can certainly do it. But the men who went with him said, we can't attack those people. They're stronger than we are. They spread bad reports among the Israelites. And they said that, the land we explored devours those living in it. And the people there are of great size. They're called Nephilim. And it says that we seem like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. So basically what we see here is that God had instructed Moses to pick a guy from every tribe, and based on the way they used to do things, I'm sure they considered someone that was qualified, that was respectable, who was capable, top of their class, best physical, mental shape possible. I'm sure they picked people who were younger because the journey would have been physically taxing. And so Caleb, let's talk about Caleb. So Caleb was the leader of Judah, even though his people were Edomites. And Caleb was an unlikely candidate because he wasn't a part of God's chosen people, which was Israel or Jacob, from Jacob. So based on his family heritage through Esau, Caleb was through Esau, it would have been impossible for Caleb to gain an inheritance in the promised land. It would have gone to Jacob's family or Israel's family. So based on the way their society was run, it wasn't an option for discussion. It wasn't that, everything that was chosen back then was chosen on heritage and patriarchal society. So when you think about these men going up to explore this land, and they come back and they basically say, what God said was true. All these things are awesome, and, the land flowing with milk and honey, just like God said. But the word that they used as the description, the key word that they used was but. They could have talked about how amazing and lush the land was, how it was overflowing with blessing, how God has these promises. They used the word but there was an obstacle, but there is a people that need to be overcome. These people are the exception to the rule, and the reason we can't go into the land to take it over. So think about this. Here is the promise of God, and everything that God says is true, and all they're looking at is the obstacles and the buts. And, shaking in their boots, talking about how overwhelmed they are about the people that they saw. So Caleb could have shrunk back. Remember, Caleb was not of the promised people. So he could have given way to fear. And even if he was afraid, he could have not stood up to his peers, because not only could Caleb have been afraid of the people he saw, he could have been afraid of his peers because he wasn't, from Jacob. So he could have been insecure based on his family line, based on his rightful succession or non-succession of the promised land. He could have not spoken up because he could have considered himself second class, or could have had an attitude about being second class. He could have talked himself out of it because he could have said somebody else is more qualified for the job and they should look somewhere else. So he had multiple opportunities for failure that could have gotten in his way. But Caleb doesn't do that. Caleb does what we're called to do, but we don't because of fear. Caleb stood up for God. Caleb stands up and he shuts up the but. He goes against all the other men and says they should take the land, not because of who they are, but because God promised it to them and because of who God is. So Caleb stands up and goes against all these other men and says, let's remember what the Lord told us. And he said, don't get focused on the worldly, but focused on the heavenly promises. And Caleb says, we're not the problem solver. God is. God is the one that told us to take this land. God is the one that promised to deliver us and to destroy our enemies in front of our very eyes. God is the one that will solve the problem. God is the one with the solution. God already knows what he's going to do and bring about, and he tells them what it is. They just need to follow what he says. So we're going to see later that Caleb, so what happens is God decided that Caleb is the man when Caleb says God is the man. And when Caleb stood up for God, and Caleb was speaking for God and representing for God, at that moment, he became God's man. And as for the rest of the men, it talks about how they continued in unison, talking about, but we can't attack those people. We're not stronger than them, spreading the bad report, saying that we look like grasshoppers. And this is all in Numbers 14. As you go, as you read through the rest of Numbers 14, you can see what happens. And this is way too much for me to read, so you really got to go read this on your own. But it talks about how these people had been grumbling and spreading bad reports, but it talks about there in Numbers 14 how God strikes them all down. He spreads, the guys that spread a bad report, they all died of a plague before God. And only Joshua and Caleb survived. And so this is the first example in the scriptures that we actually see of God saying someone followed him wholeheartedly. And Caleb is called out by God, literally called out, and he's raised up and he's praised because Caleb stood up for God. And the Lord, it talks about how the Lord's anger had aroused that day, and he talked about how because they had not followed me wholeheartedly, not one of those who are 20 years or old will see the promised land. Not one except Caleb and Joshua son of Nun, for they followed the Lord wholeheartedly. It talks about how the Lord's anger burned against Israel and he made them wander in the wilderness 40 years. So the Lord says not one except Caleb. Not one followed. Not one obeyed. Not one committed themselves to the Lord except Caleb. So Caleb was the exception. He wasn't overcome by the exception of those people. This was Caleb's defining moment. And God decided to use Caleb not because of his heritage, not because of his background, lineage, ability, inheritance, or anything else having to do with Caleb. God decided and called Caleb out because Caleb has had his mind and his heart, his soul, and his strength focused on the right thing, which is the Lord of all. And God said that Caleb had a different spirit in him. So it says, for the Spirit of God does not make us timid, but gives us power, love, and self-discipline. And that's what he's talking about Caleb was like. So Caleb had the same spirit, that Paul tells Timothy about not shrinking back, not being timid, not being shy to walk forward, to do what God has prodded or called us to do, and do it in humility. And it's a failure to give God everything you have. It's a failure if you don't give God everything you have, leave it all in the ring, aren't willing to fight for the death, to love God wholeheartedly. And that's really what Caleb displays. So Caleb steps up and he takes hold of, we use the word responsibility all the time. It's our responsibility that God gives us to do what we're called to do and to take the chance, to rise to the challenge. in spite of who we are or our background or our past or all of our mistakes, it's about going against everything in us to step up to do what God calls us to do. And Caleb, lays his life on the line. And he wouldn't have come into this inheritance like we talked about in the beginning because of who he was. And then it tells us later on in Joshua 14, 6 through 15, that Caleb waited 45 years for the blessing. So him and Joshua got to lead the people into the promised land. Everybody else passed away from that generation. And all the new people that were raised up were the people that God was going to take in. And after 45 years, finally Caleb gets his promise. And so what's it going to take for you to be the exception to the rule? What's it going to take for you to be the exception and not the but? To be the one standing alone, to be the one leading the pack? What's it going to take for you to do the right thing, to honor God, to have blind faith, to have blind obedience? And are you going to obey him and do what he says? Are you going to keep your eyes on him and on his promise? Or are you going to be focused on all the obstacles and the people who seem like giants, or feeling like a grasshopper in your own mind? So what is your defining moment? What are you going to step up to be the exception about in your life? What are you going, when are you going to silence the people? When are you going to silence the voices in your own mind? So thinking about having a different spirit in you, thinking about letting go and letting the Spirit lead you through fear and through the fire to go to the promised land. And do you believe that? Do you believe that you're meant to rise to the occasion, that you're meant to step up and go to go lead the people for God, and whatever that means for in your life? Because you have been called by God to go search out the land. You have been called by God to rise up and do great things in his name. You have been called by God so he can give you and your family a blessing and an inheritance. You have been called by God so he can give you what he promised. You have been called by God so he can destroy and overcome the enemy and those that occupy the land that he promised to you. But you have to do your part. You have to rise up. You have to overcome. You have to go to battle. You have to obey the Lord your God. So today, be the exception. Be wholehearted. Have a different spirit. Stand up for God, and let our God lead you into the promised land. Have a great day.